coming. This is going to be so much fun. I'm excited. So, here's what we're going to do. I will give you a real brief who I am, why I wrote a novel set in a tattoo shop, which led to me meeting Marvin. There was a crazy story that connected us, and that I'm still grateful for it. So I'm going to be the quick portion. Then I'm going to ask Marvin a couple of questions, just to sort of, because he has 100 years of stories in him. So I'm going to try to pull out the main ones that'll give you, paint sort of some almost comic strip panel scenes from the Bowery in the 30s, 40s, 50s, the first tattoo shop on Long Island that his father and uncle opened, changes that have happened in tattooing over those many, almost a century. Maybe we'll get into some nautical stuff, maybe, but I'm going to ask him a few questions. And then I want to open it up to audience questions, because he is such a treasure trove that I would love for your curiosity to kind of pull that out. Now, because I hang on every word that Marvin says, and when we would get together for the research for this book, I'm like, tell me everything. And I'm like, dang, well, we got an hour to work with. What are we going to do? Okay. Back in the day when Marvin's grandfather was tattooing on the Bowery in New York City, the line would sometimes come out so long around the block that he could tell you that story, what they would do about that. But like all of those old school tattoo shops, they would have, flash on the wall, these pre-drawn designs. You come in, pick your thing, and they try to get them in and get them out. So I thought it would be fun for the audience Q&A that when you have a question, pick a flash design, you take it, you get to keep it. Ask a question.
You get to tattoo it on.
Or you can stick it on and pretend. So sorry, that's my son Milo. So you get to take it, ask your question, and then Marvin or I, whoever you ask, we get 5 minutes to try to get you in and get you out and get the next question up. So we're going to do like a little game with this.
Okay.
So really quick, and then I'm going to start getting into this wealth of stories. My name is June. I started writing my novel, Jobs for Girls, with Artistic Flair when I was 19 years old. I had had a lifelong love of tattoos, starting with my mom, who was tattooed. She brought me to a tattoo shop when I was 6 years old. Very unusual at the time. What I didn't know at the time is that she was being tattooed by one of the first women tattoo artists on Long Island. It was 1987. And when I began writing my novel when I was older, I worked on it for many years. Of course, I was working many different jobs. I wasn't like supporting myself with this. I got out of college, was working. I had kids, still writing. So I got to a point in the writing of the novel where I realized if I wanted to bring alive this world of a 1980s tattoo shop, I needed to be immersed in that environment. I was thinking the way F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby, and he knew all those details of what those lavish 1920s parties were like. But I was like, how am I going? I was sitting in a coffee shop having this realization, thinking, how am I gonna do this? That world has disappeared. The world of tattooing completely changed. Hygiene, styles, so much about it had changed. That world has disappeared. Even if I wanted to go to a tattoo shop, I had just had my first baby. I was nursing. He was 3 months old. I was exhausted. I'm like, what am I going to do? Like, call every tattoo shop, be like, hello, can I bring my baby and watch you like a creepy person work and just absorb your world? So I sort of, in that moment that I knew what I needed, also kind of gave up in despair, went back to doing my writing. And about an hour later, I heard a voice say to me, excuse me, did Eric do that? And I looked up, and there was a man tattooed from neck to boots. And he was pointing at my tattoo. And my tattoo was done by Eric Zabrowski. And I said, how did you know that? And he said, well, I'm a tattoo artist. I own a tattoo shop here in Rocky Point. And I know Eric, and I think I saw that in his portfolio. And I was like, are you kidding me? So then I sort of blurted out the whole story, because this was sort of amazing that a tattoo artist just got dropped in my lap. And he said, yeah, I just had a baby too, actually. You can come by. And he left, and then he came back 2 minutes later, and he said, by the way, he said, my name is Mark, and I have a guy working for me named Marvin Moskowitz. Marvin would know all about that 1980s world. He was tattooing back 70s, 80s, his family. You should come in and talk to Marvin. I didn't know at the time that Moskowitz was a legendary name in American tattooing. I didn't know that his grandfather learned from, was it Charlie Wagner?
Charlie Wagner.
Charlie Wagner, who was like,
considered the dean of New York tattoo.
he was, yeah. And and Charlie Wagner learned from Samuel O'Reilly, who invented the electric tattoo machine.
So you could say I'm
that's right.
linked
That's right.
to the invention of the tattoo machine.
Yeah.
In a way.
Wow. So in a Starbucks in Miller Place, I got linked to basically a fifth generation, like back to it was just one of those gifts that happens when you're writing. So I'm so grateful to know Marvin, and now I'm going to ask him a couple of questions.
Go ahead.
So you could be excited too. Tell me why and how did your grandfather, Willy Moskowitz, set up shop tattooing?
My grandfather was a Russian immigrant. He lived on one of those border towns. You could go to sleep Russian and wake up Polish. I was in Krakow and Warsaw, and I asked the guide about it, and she says, "What's his birthday?" She says he was Russian for a long time. So his family came here after the First World War. His father came here 2 years before. The name wasn't Moskowitz. Nobody knows how he got the name Moskowitz. It was one of those names with no vowels. You can't even pronounce it. But nobody, family mystery, nobody knows why we're Moskowitzes. But maybe in Ellis Island, you come from Russia, you're Moskowitz. So anyway, the family came over and they settled in Ludlow Street on the Lower East Side. That was not too far from the Bowery, which was the Bowery at that time. You had the seaport, so you had the Navy, the Marines, this and that, looking for a good time all the time. But I'll go a little into the future. In 1928, he was working with his father in a tailor shop. He married my grandmother in 1929. Her brother was a barber. So all of a sudden in 1930, my grandfather is a barber. And he bought a barbershop. But on the Bowery, it was underground, in the basement basically. The store on top was a Chinese herb thing. In fact, in the pictures of it and stuff, you can see the Chinese letters. And he cut hair for a few years. He had what they call transient tattooers. They show up, they wouldn't. One guy he had was Al Neville, who was credited with giving Norman Rockwell the tattoo machine, to study for that Navy picture where all the names are crossed off. Anyway, Charlie Wagner comes over one day and says, "Willie, you're getting $5 a haircut. You could get $10 for a tattoo." He fixed up the back room a little better, and my grandfather became a tattooer. And that's how he got into the business, and the legend began. But he didn't start tattooing really until about 1935. And can I tell the stories about...
Yeah, please tell. Like, what was that
stories
atmosphere?
at that time. He'd be giving a guy a haircut. Somebody would come in for a tattoo. He'd put the hot towel on the guy, do the tattoo, come back, take the hot towel off, send the guy on his way, forgetting he only cut one side of the guy's hair. And same thing with a shave. He'd forget he only shaved half the guy's face. There's a saying on the Bowery, you see a lot of signs, black eyes made to look natural, because the Bowery was a bucket of blood. But I don't know how it is today, but it was that way through the 50s also. But anyway, the tattooers are getting credited with making the black eyes look natural. It was the barbers that did it. My father used to tell me his father had a jar of leeches, and you would put the leech on the eye and it would suck out the blood, and then you'd use pancake makeup and send the guy on his way. Huh. And I looked it up recently, and these leech jars, it was like a whole industry, all kinds of fancy and things to put leeches in.
So during that time, what was the atmosphere of a Bowery tattoo shop like? Like if we were to go back in time.
Back in time.
And it could even be from the time that, you know.
According to my uncle, in the basement, there was no heat. He had a gas heater there, which he blames for my grandfather in later years getting Parkinson's and passing away. But anyway, at that time, well, when my father, excuse me, when my father describes it, when my father ended up on the Bowery tattooing full time when he was 16. Any of you know what a yeshiva is?
Yes.
Well, my father went to junior high at yeshiva, so the story is he went to yeshiva during the day and the Bowery at night to tattoo. My father would explain it that you had, the subway was on top, you had the L's on top, and you only had streaks of light coming through. So it was always dark and not an atmosphere to give you a good attitude. And it was a bucket of blood. You had the sailors, the Marines, like I said. You had the Mafia. Little Italy was there. You had the Chinese. I got some Mafia stories later on, a couple of them. But that's how it was. It just was a dingy bucket of blood. Some of the fights my father and uncle had, and my grandfather are legendary. There's one, my father's brother-in-law, Flatbush Stan, they called him. He was a tattooer. And him and my uncle were working with my grandfather one night. Some guy comes in and just punches my grandfather. So my two uncles beat the guy. They thought they killed him. They dumped him in a lot. And they went back about 3 o'clock in the morning to get rid of the body, but the guy was gone. And my aunt remembers telling me how my one uncle, Flatbush Stanley, kept pacing back and forth. We did a bad thing. That's how it was.
Yeah.
Tony Polito, who was the king of Brooklyn in tattooing, he tattooed underground his whole life. But anyway, he used to go visit them. And one day he visited him and he sees a guy, he thought the guy got hit by a car. My uncle and father comes and says, nah, he gave us some trouble. And he goes in and there's blood all over the place on the walls where the flash was. When they moved to Long Island, they didn't even bother cleaning it. They just hugged it up on the wall. But that's how it was. It was blood money. Everybody thinks, you know, they were heroes, but as my father and uncle said, we had families to feed. But my grandfather found his niche on the Bowery. You couldn't get him off of it. The people, the fights, everything going on there, he found his place. During the Second World War, when meat and gas and everything else was rationed, he used to come home with stacks of ration coupons. No, he just loved it. He had this Laotian cut in hair for him, Terry. How I remember the guy and how he looks, I have no idea. Because during World War II, I wasn't a thought yet. But that's how it was. They were across, when they moved to, that number 12 was across from, what's another word for like pharmacy in those days?
Apothecary.
Yeah, which was a tourist stop. It was like the biggest one. My father says as a kid, when he would go to work with his father, he would go look around, he'd watch the guy make the cough medicine. And he would put in his cocaine in it, mix it around. And he said you had a line at the Bowery Bums and everybody was coughing.
So can I ask you a question
Yeah.
about, so you mentioned the Navy during all that.
Yes.
And with this being a Moby Dick nautical.
Okay.
Yeah, can you tell me a little bit about sailor tattoos or sailors coming in?
Well, the ones that didn't start fights with each other or with my father and uncle or whatever, they would get, well, a Navy tattoo, just to explain a couple of things, if they crossed the equator, they got a shelled up turtle, which is a turtle the right way, not upside down. And there used to be a tattoo. They get a chicken on one, or a rooster on one foot, and a pig on the other. That just meant they survived the seas. But they got eagles, they got mermaids, they got anchors. Anchors was a big thing they got. I mean,
flags. Flags are big too, right?
Flags were big back then, during the war. And
even now.
yeah, it's coming back. I used to give those flags for somebody else to do. For some reason, I could never get the order of the stripes right. So sometimes there was one or two too many. I had to do black shading. And you make sure you bandage it quick so the guy don't see it. And there's an old saying, there used to be carnival tattooers. All the carnivals had tattooers, and they would wrap you up and tell you to, you know, come back in a day or two or take a look at it, but they were gone already to the next town. No.
So how did it come about? So a big wrench was thrown in all this when New York City outlawed tattooing in the early 60s. Tell me about that.
What happened is, in the late 50s, 58, 59, my father got wind of something that the Board of Health something was brewing. And in the early 60s, the Board of Health came around and they wanted it out. Mayor Wagner, my father was told Mayor Wagner wanted it out. They threw it out, the tattooers won it, the case, and then on appeal it was overturned. It put people out of business. People were making a good living. There's stories that my father and uncle threw the Board of Health guy out, so they got mad. They went to some tattoo places. There was dry heat at the time, no water clays, dry heat. And they would pick up the thing, there'd be Chinese food in it, or a chicken or something. So
In the sterilizer.
In the sterilizer, the
When
dry
they were
heat
supposed to be
sterilizer.
using the sterilizing equipment.
You use the same needles. Tattooing up until the late 70s, maybe the mid 1980s, you used the same needle, no gloves. If you had a good needle, you just wash it with alcohol. What are you gonna throw it? Because you had to make your own needles at that time. When I used to go to work as a teenager with my father, I made needles, I mixed inks. We made the own needle. The needle is on the needle bar with a loop on the end. We bought the raw material, we made the needle bar. So you did everything yourself. So.
Do you want to show them the pigment bags?
Oh, this is the pigment bag. But when my father and uncle were in the supply business, we bought it in bins like this. So they had my father and uncle owned the building, so they had the upstairs, a little room with one little window, and I'd wear a suit, white, that you could throw out, a mask, but it's so fine, I'd take everything off, I'd ring around, I'd go home, I'd have to shower for an hour. Ivory soap was the only thing I had hair then, the only thing that took it out of my hair. And I did that for years until 78. I got married and decided that they opened the shop for me. I'm like, you gotta go on your own.
So your father and your uncle, they kind of saw.
Going back to that, they saw what was happening.
Yeah.
In '59, they went out to Farmingdale from the Bowery and rented a back room in some place in the town of Farmingdale. And how I know that is every time I went to work with my father when they were finally on the Sunrise Highway, we would stop at this ice cream place and he'd tell me they make the best fudge in the world. And I heard the story how they had that little place in the back. My grandfather had Parkinson's already. He died in '62. He's only 54. So it was just my uncle and my father. And then they opened up on Great Neck Road in Amityville, Copiague, one of those things. And a little strip mall. There was a lady that made fried fish. Well, I went, she had a son my age, I played cards with him and stuff. I never knew what the other stores were. I don't know if they were even stores there. But I do remember there was like a house set back, and they said it was an Indian lived there, but it was a black guy. And they said, what kind of Indian? I don't know, he's an Indian. That's what they told me. I expected to see a guy with a headdress come out and stuff.
So that was a different time in history.
That was in the early 60s.
So, can I jump in with a question?
Yes.
Okay.
Once I start talking.
So tell me about learning to tattoo.
Learning to tattoo. This is what my father and uncle did. They made a space in the back. The machines have capacitors on it that reduce the spark that comes out. It's all DC current that machines run on. So they gave me an old machine with a spark about that big. The tubes, they call Jonesy tubes. Jonesy tubes, after the guy that made this Jonesy machine. Pencil, thinner than a pencil, here, and they would get me guys to tattoo. You couldn't barely tattoo with those machines. So I kind of learned on the job. And I had friends. I put on one friend, I don't know why, wanted a big yellow Tweety bird. The feathers, they look, the wiggly lines, but they look like feathers. And to this day, I don't know if he regrets it, but he always goes like this to me. But they sent me to Tony Polito, who I mentioned. And first time I saw a needle jig, how to make needles. I was making them to groupings. You take your 4 or 5 groupings, you put it in this little jig, where you made holes in a soda can for the different thickness of the needles. You put it in there, little solder on top. Then they had another thing you put it in, and you run the solder down to about that far from where the needle is. With thread, you put it on the needle bar that we made ourselves, solder it, and that was your needle. First time at Tony Polito's, I saw a needle jig. You put everything down in this jig. You had a thing with groupings. You put the needles in. I says, what the hell did my father and my uncle making me do here? I was making hundreds of needles that way. But Tony Polito, he liked to eat, so he'd show me for about, I go to Brooklyn to see him from Suffolk County. He'd show me for about an hour, and then he says, let's go get some Chinese food. It was on the corner where he lived. He had his own room with his own curtain in the restaurant there. And then after you ate about $100 worth of Chinese food, his thing was, you want more? I'll get you more. That's how I learned to tattoo, more or less on the job. But I was making everything. It's just tattooing, you got to get the feel. Your machines are like shoes. You got to get the feel of them.
For a little context for how things have changed, now there are hundreds of colors of ink available. They're ready-made. They're in bottles. You order them. All of that equipment that he was talking
Everything's
about.
ready-made.
Needles is all ready-made. Obviously, single-use now.
Yes.
That is all. Everything disposable. Everything sterile. The
Yes.
things that Marvin had to do by hand. A tattoo apprentice can't even.
No, they don't even know how to do
right
it.
now.
Some people, when they do their apprentice, the old timers who learned that way make them do it anyway. But today, there's no old timers left. They all learned when everything was ready made. Even the stencils today. I brought a sample.
Yeah, where's your stencils? So
Today they use, I don't know if you're familiar with tattooing, they use paper stencils. And the image doesn't move. I'll show you how we used to do it.
Where is your, do you know where your
It was in one of my,
Something's
Is it in here?
it's in one of those. Let me see.
So today if you go to get a tattoo, they'll draw it up. Often they'll draw it on an iPad or something digital. They can move it around, and then that digital image can be like printed out, and then they put it directly on you. But this, they'll tell you how this amazing thing works.
We had to get acetate or plastic. And did you see like Jesus had it?
Yes.
And you would put this over the design. This, I know they call it a vice drill or something, and we used to buy I put a nail in it, but it's not working anymore with the nail in it. They used to use stylus for the old record machines, which was sharp, and you would put grooves in it, trace it, and this side has an indent in it. You would put ground charcoal on it, blow the excess off, or like that, shave the skin, put a very thin layer of Vaseline, you would place that like that, and there's your lines. Now, if it was summer, and a guy, they break out in cold sweats, people sometimes, their skin beads up, it would drain off, or you would smear part of it off. So what you would do is wash it off, put it back on, but if you see some real old tattoos, they might lean this way, they might lean that way. It was, you can see right through it, but it was hard. But that's how you did tattooing. So you had to hope that, you know, I'm a tattooer, not a tattoo artist. I could draw birds. What's that?
What's the difference?
The difference, a tattoo artist, well, today you have the guys that could just draw it right on you, the design. I can't do that. I gotta use a stencil. So I'm not a tattoo artist, I'm a tattooer.
I would say, for an example of somebody who would call themselves a tattoo artist, this is somebody that I interviewed for an article I wrote, and these are like photorealistic. Yeah, you can, if you want, I can pass a couple of things around from.
Now imagine doing a big eagle chest this way.
And so the ones that I'm sharing are like, these are and these are all women tattoo artists, which was very rare back in the day.
Yes.
Marvin's, grandfather.
Well, you had one of the first tattoo artists was Millie Ho.
Yeah.
And she actually, my grandfather tattooed, she bought Charlie Wagner's shop. He was at 16 Bowery. He went to Chatham Square. Millie Ho bought his store. They were a thing at one time, but they weren't then. And when she bought the store, she put a sign in there, "Don't get tattooed by your husband."
Tell him, girl.
She tattooed. It's like you have all tattooers here. All the tattooers in New York City back in the 40s, 50s, with Chatham Square and the Bowery, it was just, they were all over, next to each other. Some decided to go to the city, Times Square. A couple of guys went to the store. In those days, they didn't last long in Times Square for some reason. But they were all on top of each other. My grandfather and Millie Ho, but they were friendly and with each other. So, and all the tattooers weren't after each other, never badmouthed each other. Though my father used to say, if a tattooer is coming in, you say hello. He wants to see how busy you are, what your business is.
So, why don't we open up to questions?
Go ahead.
Because, yeah, it's, who wants to be the first person to pick a design off the wall?
Well, can I just ask a historical question, and I'm not going to be part of that.
There's plenty here.
From Marvin, how you're describing what the scene was in the Bowery and this bucket of blood and all of that.
Go ahead.
To June, you're 6 years old. You're going to a tattoo parlor with your mom, and it's run by women, or the particular artist is a woman tattoo artist. So,
yeah.
Like, how did we get there?
So I'll give you my quick thing, and then I'll hand it over to Marvin. But so when I went was very much a transitional period, and that's the period that my book is written in also.
Yeah.
So the woman who tattooed my mother was at a shop called Peter Tattoo, which I know Marvin will know. It was in Hempstead. It was, it was rough and tumble, and
he was the second shop on I consider Long Island, Nassau, and Suffolk.
yeah.
If anybody from the Bronx, Queens,